Okay.
Good morning, everybody. This is Ken Long and Ron Magnuson. We're going to work through Ron's presentation here on the flipped classroom. A few more administrative remarks than would normally be in here because we're using this for demonstration purposes. The research suggests that having talking heads like my fat round head in the window uh, improves retention or appreciation by the students. In my case, you can see that's evidence to the contrary. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this for right now, but this is just a way to show that head inside the video is a technique. It's usually recommended, adds personalization to it and whatnot, but we're going to enjoy Ron's presentation without. So we're using GoToWebinar from our offices to make this presentation through the web, and GoToWebinar offers a conference or video recording function to include capturing any discussions and questions that go through text boxes on the side. And so it can be a very powerful way to conduct online synchronous sessions, but then also use that as a way to develop materials for a flipped classroom for people that can't attend or for who might need to review this as a resource. So having said that, I just want to welcome my friend Ron. I appreciate all the hard work you've done on this, and I'm looking forward to the presentation. So I'm going to pass it over to Ron, and off we go.
Thanks, Ken, and greetings from the University of Pittsburgh, where it's cold today. What I'm going to talk about is my labor relations class. It's an undergraduate class of HR majors in the business school at the University of Pittsburgh. I have about 32 students in the class. That's typically the size I have. It's a required course for HR majors, and most of them are juniors or seniors, and you can see their happy faces because they're quite pleased that they're getting out of class on Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock. Primarily in the class, we have three simulations that we do, three major projects that we do. One centers around a union organizing effort, and the second one is a typical labor relations and labor bargaining unit negotiations. They negotiate a contract. And lastly, we look at dispute resolution, and we actually go through an arbitration simulation for that. The two I'm going to talk about today are organizing and arbitrations. Although I do want to tell you that the students are proud that they just reached a tentative agreement in their negotiation simulation. So they've just concluded that one. As you can see here, they have the traditional handshake at the end of their tentative agreement, and we're going to be wrapping up the negotiation simulation here in the next week or so. But what I want to talk with you about is first is the organizing effort. There's a ton of learning objectives that I have in this particular exercise. And for those of you who aren't familiar with union organizing, basically it's been an issue in our country since the late 1800s, and unions have had, in their minds, a difficult time organizing a collective bargaining unit within the workplace. And there's several reasons for that, but they're still very active, and it's important for my students to understand the process. And so here are some of the learning objectives. First, there is a ton of information on the NLRB governmental website, and I want them to learn how to access it and how to use it. So that's one objective I have. I don't want them to be afraid of these government websites. I want them to get comfortable with them, and that's one of the objectives. Probably the thing that I take away most from this is that it gives them a much richer understanding of all the steps involved in the organizing process, from interest, if you would, of a number of employees up until the NLRB certifying election up until the election. One of the side objectives that we have is the ability to communicate persuasively, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but this gives them practice to to not just present and communicate, but to communicate in a manner where they're trying to convince or persuade the parties listening. Students come into this class with a bias towards management, and I go to great lengths to try to have them appreciate both sides of the process, both the union and the management. In fact, one of my old, I guess you'd be an adversary, is the former president of a large union in this area that I used to negotiate with, and I have him come in to one of the classes so they can meet a president of a union and hear their perspective. But certainly when they go through this exercise, half of them have to act and represent union, and it does give them quite an appreciation of both sides. There's an awful lot that goes on in an election campaign, but there's an awful lot that goes on prior to the election, and this gives them a much better understanding of what those activities are, and I think once they go through them themselves, it gives them a richer understanding about how complex they are and how important they are. One of the, and I'm sure the audience may not be that familiar with the Employee Free Choice Act, but that is an act that was submitted and addressed in 2009 but was never passed. It is something that the union feels adamant about, and basically this act would bypass the election process if it was ever passed. The union's still adamant about it, and going through this exercise really gives the students a much deeper appreciation of why the union feels so strongly about this act. And finally, one of the other objectives in this exercise is to have students think and act on their own. What I mean by that is that my students tend to think very linearly. They love to look at something and make progress in a straight line. They like to have the instructions very clear, and they're very good at following through on very clear and concise objectives and instructions. What I like to do is give them a broader assignment and have them think on their own, and have, if they might run into a roadblock, they have to think about, how do I get around that roadblock? And I'll talk a little bit more about that and how I think the students sort of learn, if you would, and get a little bit more confidence that they don't need clear and concise instructions. They need an understanding and some confidence to be able to accomplish what they want to do. The structure of how it's set up is really quite straightforward. Based on the number of students I have, I had 3 cases, and obviously there was a management and a union team on each particular case, about 4 or 5 to a team, and I spent a decent amount of time assigning the teams, making sure they're diverse. By diverse, I'm looking for backgrounds, whether they have an accounting or finance background, maybe a certain perspective. So I spend a decent amount of time after I've surveyed the students making sure that the teams are very diverse. So there's a decent amount of work that's done outside the classroom, and I just want to go through the various ones. On my part, I look at the NLRB website and I pick recent cases. So the cases that they were assigned were actual cases that the elections had just occurred, and that's important for a couple reasons. One, the parties that the students are going to interview are much more willing to talk about since the election already occurred. They probably wouldn't want to give away any secrets or strategies if the election was still scheduled. The second thing is that I think making it current adds the opportunity that there's some information on the website, on the internet, that they could explore, and also I think it makes it more real to them. These are real cases that are currently being addressed, and I think it really helps them out. So one of the things they have to do is to read the recent election decisions. So what these decisions are by the NLRB is that they've looked at the petition by the petitioner, and they've decided to certify an election, and they've set the date, and they give them the details, if you would, of what the petitioner asked for and what the details were behind their particular request. So they have to read this and become extremely familiar with it. Then they got to really do a lot of research. So the decision itself in the NLRB website only gives a certain amount of information. They're going to have to research what the issues were. They definitely have to do a lot of searching on the website to see what's been in some local newspapers. I think the 3 cases we did, one was in New Orleans, one was in California, and the other was in Chicago. So they weren't local to Pittsburgh. So they had to do a decent amount of research to get more familiar with the case. Finally, not finally, but next they have to develop a lot of questions. So there's only so much information you can get on the election decision and on the internet, and so they need to really think, what are they missing? What do they still need to gather in order to really assess what's going on? And these questions are then posed in various interviews they have with the stakeholders. So many of them will contact the local union if they're representing the union, or the petitioner, or maybe some employees. Many of them will contact management, maybe the HR office, maybe the local management as well. But they're going to try to contact as many stakeholders as they can to really get a strong feeling of what the issues were from the perspective of the people that they're representing. And this is one where they run into a lot of roadblocks. You know, I can't get a hold of the union. Oh, this person won't return my call. And this is one of the side benefits, I think, of doing an exercise like this, is it teaches them to think creatively and think more independently. You know, I'll always sort of pose the question, well, okay, what would you do if you run into it? Do you just give up, or are there other ways to get the information, or are there other ways to find contacts? And I think the students are always very proud of the fact that they can sort of overcome all the roadblocks that they run into. And then finally, there's an awful lot of time preparing the deliverables, and I'm going to go over the deliverables in a minute. They have to work within their team, and since the deliverables are heavily graded by observers, they have to really rehearse and prepare. So the biggest deliverable is a presentation. They're going to ultimately present the facts of the case. They're going to present the issues from the perspective of who they're representing. And when they present this, if you can picture this, there's 5 teams that are listening. There's 5 teams that are listening, and there's an awful lot of learning that's going on from those who are listening in addition to the ones that are presenting. For example, they present an executive summary with all the details, the issues, the status, and everyone hears both perspectives. So they not only hear from the union, but they hear from the management. And this really contrasts things, because while the facts, at least in theory, should be the same, you can hear some biases and you can hear some differences to get an understanding of why folks might be adverse and why they might have a different position on this. Then what they do is they conduct an employee meeting, just like they would if this was a true election. So if you're a union, you're conducting a meeting prior to the election with all the people who will be voting, and you're trying to make it as realistic as possible, because ultimately you want them to vote your way. And so it's very realistic. They come in dressed accordingly. Some of them bring refreshments. They bring handouts. They stick to their roles. So the union typically will come in and maybe there'll be someone there from the national union. There might be a local employee that's supporting the union. There might even be somebody from another location who is in the union and wants to share their history and their perspective. And they really get into this. They really have a lot of fun with it, and they try to be as creative as they can. But ultimately, it ends with questions. And the questions really make them think on their feet. I'm always prepared to ask some questions sort of from the other side's perspective. So I'll give you an example. Oftentimes the management will bring the CEO in And so I'll ask the CEO, I said, when's the last time you were at our site, and why don't I see you very often? You only come down when there's a problem. You only come when there's a problem. You never come normally. How can I trust that if I vote down the union that I'll have your ear, kind of a thing? And so it really, I try to ask questions that they wouldn't anticipate if you would, and it sort of presses them a little bit. And then ultimately, we conduct a vote to see which side put forth the most persuasive case to vote for the union or to vote against the union. They are also required to bring a handout or a deliverable, something that represents the campaign. Sometimes the unions bring buttons or pamphlets or flyers, and I just want them to really get into the election mode or the election campaign mode as much as they can, and it's always been very successful because I can just see the passion in their eyes and the excitement, and they know ultimately that they're being graded on their ability to convince the audience. So that's just a quick summary of the organizing campaign. I wanted to switch a little bit of gears and talk about the arbitration case that we do, and we use experience-based learning for in the dispute resolution topics. What we do is we actually have an arbitration case. This case also has a number of learning objectives. Obviously, we want them to understand the grievance process, and all contracts spell out a specific grievance process. We want them to understand the various steps of that process. We want them to experience and prepare to testify. So since we conduct an actual arbitration hearing and there are witnesses, they have to prepare and testify, and it gives them great experience for that. Obviously, sitting through a hearing, it gets them first-hand experience on how an actual arbitration hearing is conducted. And then they learn the downsides of arbitration, because if anybody's ever been through one, they're expensive. They're like an actual trial, if you would. They're cumbersome. They often are very adversarial. And I want them to learn the downsides and experience the downsides of these things. And this helps them consider the value of resolving disputes, maybe settling disputes before they have to go to arbitration. And also maybe consider the value of just avoiding the dispute to begin with. In order for them to really understand the downsides, they have to actually experience the downsides. They have to have the frustration, if you would, of going through this rather complex exercise. So there's a lot of stakeholders in this particular assignment, and this one takes an awful lot of work on my end to put together. One of the stakeholders are the actual arbitrators. These are three individuals. We have three cases in this one that are actual local arbitrators who will come in and volunteer their time to conduct the hearing. The second group are law students. At the University of Pittsburgh, we're fortunate enough to have a law school here, and I've worked with one of my colleagues to have, I think in this particular year, I have 8 law students that are going to act as the attorneys. And so they're preparing briefs, they're preparing exhibits, and so this is actually an assignment for them in their class, and I've been working with the professor on that. And then of course, we have the witnesses, and the witnesses tend to be, they're my students, and obviously some natural witnesses are the grievance supervisor, maybe a union representative, somebody from HR. So we have a number of folks who are going to be actual witnesses and be called to the stand. And then just to sort of round out the 32 folks to make sure everyone has a role, we have observers, and these observers are going to be in the 3 different arbitration hearings with the perspective of either the union or management, and they'll be required to participate in the discussion. They'll be required to sort of write an assessment, if you would, at the end of the arbitration hearing. So lots of prep to do prior to the hearings. By the way, the hearings this particular term are coming up on March 30th, and so this is still fresh in my mind. you have to actually do some research and find some actual arbitration cases. So there's tons of them out there. You want to find ones that the students can relate to. So there's lots of criteria I use to look, but I researched, I don't know, hundreds of arbitration cases to sort of find ones that would be a good fit for our class. I want to have some diverse, obviously one that had discipline, I think, was one, and another one was a work assignment issue, and another one was a pay issue. So I tried to have some diversity in the cases. And then going out and finding the local attorneys that are arbitrators and the law students requires some time and obviously needs some planning, but these folks signed up. We have to sort of prep the attorneys and the law students. They have to be taught on how to prepare exhibits and how to be a lead attorney in a case like this. And so I have somebody come in from the outside that goes into the law school class that spends a decent amount of time prepping them to perform their role. And then ultimately assigning the witnesses. I tend to like to give the students preferences, and so I will send out the arbitration cases and have them read them. Of course, they have to be scrubbed without the decision. Since the arbitration cases I have the arbitrator's decision, we scrub them so they don't see and know how the arbitrator in this case actually ruled, but they can see all the other material. And so after they've had a chance to read it, I give them the opportunity to volunteer for particular roles, and I take that into consideration as I assign the witnesses. And then finally, once the witnesses are assigned, then we need to arrange for the attorneys and their clients, if you would, these witnesses to meet and prepare to testify. Of course, there's a lot of logistics. I've got to reserve and arrange all the rooms to get them all set up because we only have a little over an hour, if you would, to conduct this. So once the schedule for the day goes pretty straightforward, the assumption is they're going to come in all prepared. We're going to start with the hearing, and we're going to run the hearing for about an hour. And then we're going to gather back in the central classroom, and we're going to wrap up with the arbitrators and the law students. And we're going to assess each case and really talk about what they learned, if you would, in each case. The wrap-up is really important. So we not only wrap up in person at the end of the arbitration cases, the end of the arbitration hearings, but we all have the students write a short assessment on their observations with the hearing. So I've been doing these simulations for several years, and try to make improvements to them each time, learn from opportunities and learn from mistakes. But I received a ton of comments. I'm sure, like most of you, we receive anonymous feedback at the end of each term. I've just picked out sort of some ones that related to the simulations and the assignments that they've had. But in my comments and my assessment, they've always been some of the most popular ones. I think they really appreciate the hands-on learning, the learning by doing, if you would. Some key takeaways from this kind of an approach. It does take an awful lot of work, but actually, believe it or not, having an A class is a good thing for two reasons. One, when you're looking for rooms, there's not a lot of competition, if you would, in the building at 8 o'clock. And secondly, when you have outsiders involved, it's a lot easier to get an outsider to come to your class when it's sort of first thing in the morning, where they still have the bulk of their day in front of them. Find midday classes to be a bit of a challenge when it comes to that, because it's just hard to get people to commit. It really tears up their day. There's clearly strong retention by doing. I asked them some I found very tough questions in the exams, and I really feel like their positive answers, sort of affirm that they have a deep understanding of this. I tend not to ask simple multiple choice and questions. I tend to ask questions that they have to write out a short essay and really demonstrate their knowledge of an issue. And I've been very pleased with how they've retained the information from these exercises. Support from your administration is really important, and I'm fortunate at the University of Pittsburgh that our school not only promotes EBL, but they expect it. And this is really important. I'll give you, it's helpful in getting rooms, it's helpful in getting the resources, but it's also helpful. They've been fighting the Central University against having Friday classes, and that helps us with experienced learning, because the longer the classes are, the more you can get done. The university has been trying to have us to go to Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes, and it's just too short of time to be able to really get any kind of meaningful experience-based learning done. I find that, for example, when I teach an evening class, it's 3 hours long, it's even better, but these hour and a half really give me enough time to be able to get done some exercises. Otherwise, I'd be less than an hour. And so the administration is very supportive of all these exercises, and I think that's really helpful and really important. Another takeaway is that it's a different kind of preparation than a typical lecture or a typical class. There's a lot of logistics involved. There's a lot of different kinds of preparation involved, of research and really getting the right kinds of material in front of these students that could be used right off the bat. And I guess the other takeaway is it really aligns with my background. Some of you might know I worked 28 years in corporate, and so many of it is a head of human resources, and so it definitely helps the students know that the person leading these exercises was somebody that has sort of been there and done that myself. It certainly gives me a lot of connections, whether it be to federal mediators or to arbitrators or to union officers. It definitely helps. When you're done with these things, these exercises, having a wrap-up is important. You got to really have an effective wrap-up. You got to really have some time for the students to reflect on what they learned, what questions they have, to hear other people's perspectives and discuss it. That's really a key component to it. And then one of the things that I find to be really helpful in this kind of approach is that I really try not to treat them like students. All along the way, since they are junior and senior level students, I try to treat them like they're HR professionals and treat them as if they were my former employees or my employees that I used to have working for me. And that goes a long way to add to the realism of it. Whether it be my attendance policies or whether it be how I convey the work or how I grade, treat them like they are professionals and not students, and that's extremely helpful. So with that, I'll leave it to any questions that anybody might have, and I look forward to discussing this particular approach and how, even if you're not teaching a labor class, how you can use something like this, if you would, in some of your flipped classrooms. Thanks for your time and attention.
Hey, Ron, terrific presentation. Just a couple follow-up questions I have. So when you have them role play, and you mentioned that you are prepared with some background questions to prompt if needed. Yeah. And so you have an expectation of what kinds of things should emerge. How about the challenge of deciding when to let them stew in their own juices and when to let it bubble, and when do you decide to intervene? And when you do, does that disrupt the lesson flow at all, or are you adopting a role that makes that questioning or that prompting sort of a natural part of the experience? In other words, do you have a way that you can get that question inserted without kind of disrupting the scenario that you've created?
Oh, that's a great question. The only times I ever ask questions is when they're actually presenting, as if it was done. During the preparation for it, when they come to me, when they get stuck, I don't ask questions as much as what I always do is I always try to say, well, let's just picture this. If it was real life, and you were really doing this, how would you approach it? How would you approach your boss? How would you approach your colleagues with this. And so that typically gets them sort of moving forward, and it definitely doesn't disrupt the learning process, because I actually like when they get stuck. I actually like when they fail. I find there to be a lot more learning and retention by them getting stuck or failing and then having to sort of think it through on their own. I try to refrain from ever really, if you would, giving them the answer, or if you would, giving them some good direction. I know it sort of frustrates them to some degree because they always think I'm like the solution provider, but having them think on their own is really an important part of this process.
Well, I agree with that. I think those moments when they're trying to get traction, when their wheels are
Hmm.
spinning just a little bit, is really the prime teachable moment that we
Exactly.
want them to learn to think on their feet, to respond to that environment, to be able to draw on their own resources. And so keeping that locus of control on them, having them search within or among members of their team for solutions, really is the best part of the preparation. If the scenario never really gets them to the boundary of their knowledge, it almost becomes too scripted, and you almost have to raise the bar. So you try to get them to the edge of their knowledge right away so that you can really work on that boundary. So I think
Yeah,
that's
ambiguity is a good thing, Ken. You know, ambiguity is actually something that they're going to see after they graduate, and you know, learning to deal with it effectively and work through that is a great skill and it builds a lot of confidence.
yeah. My next question has to do also with kind of the role-playing function and the risk that you take setting up an elaborate, and I mean that in a very positive way, in the fact that it's realistic and rich detail. So you're establishing a simulation environment that really requires these guys to be prepared when they come
Hmm.
in, and that puts some risk on the educational outcomes for everybody. Have What kind of forcing functions have you examined to ensure that folks are coming into the classroom ready to contribute to the collaboration? Because clearly, if somebody hasn't done their work and they come to the meeting unprepared, the other side's going to have an easy win, but it doesn't let us get to the educational outcomes. So, any thoughts on
Yeah,
how to do that?
yeah. You know, one of the things on the arbitration side, it's a little easier because I have law students that are really helping them be prepared, and so they're meeting with them separately. The risk that you identified is more on the organizing side. You know, you might have one side come in a little bit more prepared than the other side, and it makes sort of an easy win, if you would, or an easy differential. And one of the things that I like to see is that, you know, I don't mind it as much. It doesn't happen very often, but I don't mind it as much because I think there's learning from that that they say, okay, what happens when you're not prepared? Who's going to
Yeah.
win this? And they of the 6 presentations they get to see, they get to contrast, like, wow, boy, that management team really did a lot more research than we did. That management team came a lot more prepared than we did. That's why I like to have multiple sessions so they can compare and contrast. You know, oftentimes, you know, nobody really nails it and makes it perfect, but there's little strengths, if you would, that they could be gleaned from each of the ones, and there's probably some opportunities from each of the ones, and that's why the wrap-up's really important, as we sort of compare and contrast. I mean, what did we observe in some of these? What was missing? And you know, to be honest with you, if they all come in perfect, like you mentioned, I think the learning opportunity would be a little bit less. There wouldn't be as much contrasting and comparing.
Yeah, I think you get a chance to see errors of omission and errors of commission,
Exactly.
and they learn professional behavior about what good prep looks like and feels like. And so I think you make a real strong case for the importance of doing iterations of this so that we can grow from it, and then being able to raise the expectations as you go. And so rather than trying it all at once as the final and then say, oh, wow, they really were not prepared for the level of preparation execution that's required. And I think that ties into a point I would also highlight, your idea about you can't really afford higher level classes like this on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday basis because you just don't have time to sink into the role, to do the prep and the rehearsal,
Mm-hmm.
and then the reflection on the learning in a day on, day off kind of environment. We run into the same challenges here when we try to cram our electives into the last session of the term, and often we sacrifice that ability to do deep learning and reflective learning as a consequence. So I guess the last question I would have has to do with your thoughts on assessing performance, because clearly there's individual contributions to group learning that goes above and beyond what the student is demonstrating their own particular mastery, but they also have some contribution to group learning that looks like an important part of this. And then there's sort of the difference between the book learning in their head, mastery of concepts, and then the learning and action component. And I'm wondering how you think your way through the challenges of assessing all these different dimensions of performance and preparation and individual mastery as part of this rich simulation. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a fairly detailed rubric, and so for example, taking the organizing one, you know, quality of slides is an issue. The quality of the presentation, and I'll make notes on things as small as eye contact and voice inflection. So each level, the level of convincingness, the level of research, and so there's a fairly detailed rubric that I use when it comes to the presentation on the executive summary that they have to do. There's a rubric related to that as well. I'm looking for creativity, and so if for example, the handout they bring is just sort of a straightforward meeting notice with really no pizzazz or interest, my comment to them is like, well, why would I want to vote this way, or why would I even want to come to the meeting? You got to do something that is compelling. And again, I find most students are in the habit of just doing an assignment and checking it off, and they don't really consider why they do the assignment. What are you trying to achieve? And so with my grading and assessment, I try to make sure that they're always understanding that it's not me as the teacher as much grading as it's me as the audience. It's me as the person you're trying to influence, the stakeholder that you're trying to make an impact on. It's sort of grading it, and I try to grade it from that perspective. The other challenge I have, Ken, is that, as you can probably imagine, not all 4 or 5 students contribute equally, and that tends to be something that comes up more often than I like. And what I do are individual evaluations, and I have the students evaluate each other anonymously. And I always tell them that while it looks and smells like a team grade, I reserve the right to adjust the grade as I find out there are different levels of contribution. And that the threat alone, I think, tends to encourage more equal. But every once in a while, I will have somebody that I need to alter the grade with, and just because they didn't have the same level of contribution.
Well, I think the environment that you create with these guys, treating them more as employees or having that professional relationship ongoing, actually provides a good foundation for having those kinds of discussions about grades, especially since we're talking about an HR area anyway, that performance evaluation is really part of that. And so you get a chance to model that supervisor-employee relationship on the management level, and that actually becomes one of the learning outcomes that's available here. And I think that helps prepare them for the real world in which performance evaluation does matter, and that there are standards, and that there is negotiations involved in the development of that kind of feedback. And so I think this works on so many levels that it's really powerful. So hey, I really want to thank you for taking the time to putting this presentation together, and for an interesting analysis of what it is that you do. And so I want to stop the tape at this point and make a few other remarks and just say that what we've really done here is demonstrate one way in which we can support flipped classroom development by not only talking about it in this way, but also recording this. And now we can look at this artifact that's going to come from this production and realize that we can break this into different pieces that can be purposed for many different kinds of environments. This could be part of a blog show, a couple old guys sitting around drinking coffee, talking about how the Detroit Red Wings are going to whoop up on the Penguins in the playoffs. Just saying. This can be part of an archive that shows some of the things that we do at ABSEL as a conference. It acts as a flipped classroom preview of material. This is certainly video that we're going to make available to the folks coming to the workshop that will allow them to reflect on the issues and the commentary and bring questions to the class so we can get right to the things that are of most interest. And so rather than having to give a presentation and then getting 5 minutes to fish around for the most important questions and then hurrying through that and then running out of time, we can actually start right with the questions that are of mutual interest to the presenter as well as the participants. And so the central section where Ron is talking through his organizational design really can even serve as a preview of coming attractions to students who are interested in taking the course, as a presentation to administrators who are considering using that model of a course for their degree program. And so the beauty of a flipped classroom approach is that you start recognizing that there are ways to record once and use many. And hopefully that's one of the things that we can talk about during our workshop. So I'll give it once more over to Ron for any closing comments, and then otherwise we'll get about the business of producing this rascal and getting her uploaded. So any final remarks, Ron?
Can you bring up a really good point? I think one of the audiences that this kind of material is good for are the potential and future students. I think it can become sort of a selling point. It can be one that sort of sets a level of expectations and professionalism. And I've been trying to capture more pictures and more artifacts to have available for students who are about to take the class so that they can get excited about it, they can get prepared for it. And one of the things I intend to do a better job of is actually videoing some of the presentations and the material so that it creates an entire collection for students who maybe are freshmen and sophomores and still have to take this class and get prepared for it.
Yeah, great insights. To include having to get the releases from the students for permission to use their image and their content for future classes. I mean, being at a law school, being at the law school in Pittsburgh, you get that sorted out.
Every student signs a waiver at the University of Pittsburgh Business School, so that's never an issue for us.
Yeah, well, I knew you guys would think of that, coming from a long line of participants in the criminal justice system myself, often on the wrong side of that. I know exactly what you mean. Well, it does my heart good to hear that Pittsburgh accent come through. As you know, it's not really an accent, it's the proper way to talk. But it's anybody that's ever lived in Pittsburgh for a while knows it when they hear it, and it does my heart good to hear that special accent. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Appreciate you taking the time to do that.